if I should look it from the outside, I would say something like, some of these people that is, should we say, skeptic about her work, it is, from my point of view, as when a young couple is, is criticizing the teacher, that this cannot be true. The thing is that Dr. Svetlana Balabanova, she was an expert in forensic toxicology, and her critics was archaeologists, botanics, and so on. So, bottom line was that who's the expert here? And from my point of view, I don't think we can discuss if the toxins was found in the sample. That is proven. There's no room for interpretation here. What we only can discuss here is that can it come from other sources? That is a little more, should we say, problematic. First of all, these methods are every day challenged in courts around the world. And one of the, this is in German, I have to translate it. I think we call it hair shaft test. And that is basically that the hair is washed chemical. And then after it has been washed, the sample here, you analyze the liquid that is left. And this is if there's no more traces of, say, cocaine or nicotine and so on, then we conclude that the hair is now clean. And then we do the analysis of the hair in a separate test. So, if the toxic materials is only found inside the hair, then there's a clear indication that this is something that must have been taken when the mummy was alive and not by contamination. And that was exactly what she did. So Dr. Balabanova was actually quite certain that contamination was not likely. However, some critics might have a point here because they are discussing that the archaeology tests are is extremely hard to compare with modern medicine because then you have a fresh sample. You normally know what has happened with the sample, and the environment is controlled. In archaeology, these mummies can easily be 3,000 years old. They can be handled by hundreds of persons, and they can have been treated with chemicals in museums and so on. For instance, one of the mummies, the one called Henu Tau, I think it's called, has been plundered, has been transported, has been in museum in the 18th century, and has been handled in a period where people actually smoke cigars all over. So the problem was not the test of Balabanova, but the sample's history. But again, here I find it important to highlight that Dr. Svetlana Balabanova actually sent samples to 3 other laboratories that also found the cocaine and the nicotine. And that is actually a fairly strong point, which is quite often is overviewed. Is overlooked in the a lot of pseudoscientific texts. But it's also important to highlight that she was actually testing 134 other mummies. And in total, I believe it was more than 3,000 tests she did. And there was found traces of nicotine in a lot of them. And one of the problem was actually that if you compare it with should we say, a modern day smoker, the strength of the nicotine was actually up more than 30 times higher. So it was not possible, to smoke that many cigarettes, basically. But again, one of the key, should we say, defenses from the traditional archaeologists is that nobody has found a coca plant, and nobody has found, should we say, clear traces of coca in the Egypt. But the problem is that Balabanova's results has never been disproven. I think that one of the problems is with this, should we say, resistance, is that if accepted, you will have to, rewrite history. Not only Egyptology, but also botanics, commerce routes, the world history, and so on. And that they think requires, should we say, extraordinary evidence. I challenge that because it's not a problem that you find something that disproves. The problem is that you have a lot of weak results that is actually, collected, is supposed to give a strong result. That is not the, should we say, the a proper scientific view. The thing is that when you have a solid science that's actually pinpoint one thing, then you cannot take 3 or 4 week, should we say, theories or accepted archaeology facts, and then say that those 3 are stronger evidence than one that is actually following all the rules today, who is challenged every day. So I think that's not fair. Dr. Balabanova was a very competent forensic toxicology. She used methods that is challenged every day in court around the world. She actually tested against contamination by using 3 different additional laboratories in order to disprove contamination. If we open up and look a little further, it's not only nicotine and cocaine that has been found in Egyptian mummies. We also have cannabis, especially the THC. That is interesting, not because it's rare, it's actually known in the Eurasia for thousands of years. But nicotine found in hair and tissue samples has created some debate because concentrations was far higher than expected from, should we say, normal plants. Possible explanation is, of course, medical application of the plants, the use of nicotine in balsamation. It could be environmental, or it could be lost or unknown plants. But it shows that old biochemical traces is often hard to interpret later. But if we are looking at old European skeletons, then we also have found nicotine in Europe before tobacco officially come from America, and that has been found in samples of hair and bones. We found nicotine traces in skeletons about the 12th to the 14th century, and a possible explanation is plants of the night shadow family. I think it's called Solanacea. Don't quote me exactly on that one. But also from medical herbs and from contamination of earth, or should we say, the later handling of this. The thing here is that it shows that molecules can live quite for some time. Narcotic elements can be stored in hair, in tissue, in bones, in harpics and balsam, and so on. And then the problem is that it's often easier to say that the molecules is in the sample than to explain how did it get in there for 3,000 years ago. And that is basically the problem. It's easier, to say it's there than it is to explain why it's there. And one of the key problems here is actually that archaeology and chemistry, they require that you both, of course, understand the toxicology, you understand the botanics, your history, archaeology, and then also, of course, chemistry. And the Balabanova case is exactly in the, should we say, in the crossfield between all these different samples. And if you remember from one of my earlier podcasts in this season, one of the key problems in archaeology is that the silo thinking, they are working in the same way as when you have secret projects by, I don't know, NSA and so on, because the knowledge is compartmentalized. So that means that if you're living in one compartment, you do not know what's happened in your, should we say, sister compartments. And nobody is actually, or at least very few, is combining the knowledge between these different silos. I call them silos because I see that as a knowledge in this silo, and that the knowledge is kept there. It's not freely shared with the rest of them. So bottom line, if you really want to debunk her findings, you will have to know all these different specialities, and that is actually one of the key areas why it will not die. And the reason is that because there is actually a thing that is a detail that is quite overlooked in a lot of the critics about her work, and that is about metabolites. When a person takes, I don't know, cocaine or nicotine or whatever, then the cocaine is consumed by the body, and then the liver starts breaking it down. And during that process, metabolites is created, and these metabolites are stored in both in tissue but also in hair. And that is actually the strongest, should we say, proof of consummation. Because if you only find clean cocaine, then in principle it is more or less certain that it's contamination. Something has been in contact with cocaine, or it could be, I don't know, that the laboratory is not using clean measurements. But when you find metabolites, that is the same as to say that that the cocaine has been in the body because it has been metabolized. So it's the same to say that the person in life has consumed this cocaine. And if you actually look at the analysis that Dr. Balabanova did, she found cocaine, but he also found the metabolites of cocaine in hair samples. And that is exactly why she means that contamination could not explain the results. Because if only cocaine was found, then more or less case closed. Then we have a new problem with this one because in science, cocaine and metabolites are not chemical stable for thousands of years. Over the time, there's oxidation, degradation, and blah blah blah. So it is some chemist has stated that the metabolites they can be created artificial during degradation, or they can be created by converting it chemical from cocaine. In that case, the results is of course a lot more hard to analysis. In modern forensic, you analyze hair from, I don't know, a few weeks, month, perhaps a few years uh, old, but in mummies, they can easily be, the hair can easily be 3,000 years old, and it can be exposed to all kind of chemicals from balsamation, from heat, from microorganisms, and conservation things, and so on. So chemical process can change the sample. So bottom line is in this, you actually have it three different conclusions. You can first of all you can accept the conclusion that cocaine is what's actually in the hair. So in that case, then you could have an unknown commerce route. You can have an unknown plant, or you can have some very early global contact. You can also have contamination. The thing is with contamination, that is well documented that that is not likely the case. But you can also have chemical, should we say, insufficient analysis. So, so what you think is more or less a religious case. Thing is that metabolites, that is normal proof of consummation of a certain chemical. But in very old samples, the chemical samples can change, which makes it hard to make sure, but it is actually that you are measuring. I personally have, uh, should we say, traces of doubts because after reading a lot of regarding Svetlana Balabanova, I think that one of the problem is that she was German. In the beginning of the 1990s, bottom line was that the internet was almost not used in science. A lot of articles was published, especially in Germany, on German. So that means that there was no easy access for the rest of the world to these articles that she actually was publishing. And the same goes the other way around. So that meant that language, should we say, barriers, was actually a thing to consider. But it also means that the international, should we say, science debate was a lot slower than today. And if you have, should we say, a public science magazine, then it's likely that it could have, should we say, far less value on the international society than it was actually the should we say the true science potential of this discovery. Especially if you are using a German magazine that nobody in US has heard about, or in France, for instance, or UK, then they perhaps did not consider this properly. By definition, it was published, but the language barrier could be a problem at that time. But also, if you imagine that they actually were able to read that, then again, it is my thinking that critics only had limited access to the dates. So that means that all the samples on all the different might not be translated. And that is it's a fact that Dr. Balabanova, she sent the samples to 3 additional laboratories, and they repeated the results with the same conclusions. But that is not measured. It is not printed in a lot of articles that is actually critic to her work. So I personally take that as not as malevolent, but as a sign of that a barrier a language barrier was actually there and is not being identified. Furthermore, Dr. Balabanova, um, as the name indicates, that is an East European background, and she worked in Germany in a period where the Soviet Empire was just dissolved. A lot of scientists from East was actually working in Western institutions, and there was big differences in, should we say, the scientific approach. There was different laboratory standards, and there was also some skeptics between the different scientific environments. And I personally have that view that that is influencing how her work was seen. I do not have any clear evidence why nationality should be, should we say, the main focus of the critics, but nevertheless, I think that she could be, you know, it does not even sound German, that name. Things like that could have happened. Furthermore, her work was actually, should we say, attacking three major established scientific areas: botanics, archaeology, and history. If her results was correct, then these three areas should have to basically reassess all the central views. And there, Carl Sagan is cited to say that extraordinary claims requires extraordinary evidence. Actually, I think this is extraordinary evidence because bottom line is that she is not attacking all those three. The thing is that these three areas, they are trying to prove something where the data does not match up. Her data does match up. If we look at it today, if we imagine that it happened today, I think that the entire case would look completely different because nowadays we can publish a lot of raw materials where you simply can have the data, you can share this measuring, you can upload different laboratory protocols, you can analyze the results globally, where in the 1990s, especially in the beginning of the 1990s, that was basically local, it was slow, and it was very dependent of printed magazines. So I think that a lot of these conflicts was a lot harder to solve at that time than it is today. And it's also quite obvious that you have two different, should we say, scientific views of that. If we look at the forensic medicine, then it's based on experiments, it's based on laboratories, and it's easy to reproduce. And that is exactly the opposite of archaeologists, because that is an historical reconstruction. It's indirect evidence, and you have tons of different, should we say, explanations. So when these two fields is actually met, then it's quite obvious that conflicts on how evidence should be analysis is obvious. I think that if the case was surfacing today, a lot of scientific researchers would say something like that Dr. Balabanova was competent. She was working well known in toxicology, that her analysis was serious, but they will probably say that this requires some more independent evidence. It's not the same as to say she was wrong, but only that the evidence was not strong enough to change the history. So I see that as that language barriers was in effect, that we have having different cultures between what happened in Germany and how scientific worked in Germany than the same goes with the rest of the world. And then we have a very slowly international communication. So even that you have printed your scientific research and so on, they were still depending on basically, are you able to read German? And then, of course, we have the main problem that her results actually challenged one of the most established historical models ever built. If we have to dig down a little in some of the results, uh, one of the most interesting and results I found in Dr. Balabanova was her analysis of the nicotine concentrations. And some of the mummies was extremely high, and in some cases so high that they probably must have come from consummation from life. If we look at the priestess Henu Tao, Balabanova found very high concentrations of nicotine in the hair, but also traces in tissue samples and bone samples. And the levels was actually higher than, should we say, Norman smokers. That is hard to explain with, should we say, random contamination or cigarette smoke in museums. Furthermore, the process was that all the hair was washed with alcohol. The remaining alcohol was analyzed, and then afterward the hair sample itself. If the nicotine was only outside the hair, then it was contamination. If nicotine was found inside the hair, then it has to come from consummation during life. And that is actually a central argument in her work. But in some cases, the nicotine levels was very, very high. Some of them more than 30 to 35 times higher than a modern smoker. Because that generated a new problem. These levels could only come from poisoning, medical use, or perhaps some materials used in balsamation. And Dr. Balabanova actually was number 3, that the nicotine was coming from balsamation. Actually, nicotine is a very strong pesticide against insects, and it's bacteria. What do you call it? Bacteria killing material. Hence, this her suggestion was a nicotine plant could have been used in the balsamation process. If that was the case, then large amounts of nicotine was able to go from the plant into the tissue and hair after death. That could generate the very high concentrations. The critics of Balabanova's work was having here a dilemma, because if the nicotine was only on the surface, then it was contamination, but if it was found inside the hair and in very high concentrations, then contamination is hard to explain. So today, a lot of scientists is actually accepting that the nicotine in mummies is a real thing. But nicotine is not the real controversial problem. We know that nicotine can be found in a lot of plants that is found locally in Egypt and around. But so you could say yes, that Balabanova was reporting a very high levels, and her analysis almost certain was proving that the nicotine was coming inside the body and not from surface contamination. And here have in mind that nicotine is also creating metabolites in the body. And in forensic, that's actually more important than the nicotine itself, because it's actually proof of consummation. In the 1990s, a lot of the analysis was actually optimized to find, should we say, the source of the source of the measurement, which is basically nicotine, and not necessarily all the metabolites. The thing is with metabolites, that is a different degradation rate than cocaine. Than nicotine. And they can also react with balsamation and so on. So after 3,000 years, it can either be no longer there or perhaps chemical changed. And that is why that the nicotine in mummies, that is, should we say, analysis, the very, how should I put it, very, just the conclusion is not that strong. There can be possible explanations like it can be used in balsamation, contamination, chemical transformation, consumption during life, and so on. The thing is that still nicotine is actually able to bind it to keratin in the hair, and that is very strong because that can be stored for thousands of years. So even when other metabolites are gone, it's still there, and that's why they are testing it, the hairs, in archaeologists' toxicology. From my point of view, a lot of this is, should we say, resistance against change. Because if you, before you read this, already have a clear view that there was no commercial trading with South America, and everything you do is, the purpose of all kind of samples is to prove that there was no trade, then it's quite obvious that you have something that only can happen if there was trade. Then it's quite obvious that you will not support this kind of discoveries. As I said before, Carl Sagan is supposed to say something like extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I go against that, because when something is found and it's able to reproduce, you can take the same mummies again, do the same tests again, and that happened, and they have the same results as before, then it's not Balabanova that has decided that botanics has one view, that commerce has another view, and archaeologists has a third view. That is something they did. The different, should we say, different views. So I don't find it as a legal argument that it requires a much stronger argument, because it's not Balabanova that is, the creator of that view. The German philosopher in science, Thomas Kuhn, he actually wrote about this and is in his theory about paradigms. A paradigm is the model that scientists works inside. When a found does not fit that model, three things happens. First, you ignore it. Then you try to explain it away, and then at last you say, if the evidence is strong enough, then perhaps we change the paradigm. We have a lot of these examples, continental drift, for instance, but also different findings where we later have to say that, okay, we have now a new worldview. Dr. Balabanova is an interesting case because it's a gray zone. There's no doubt that she was a competent toxicology. She was working in forensic. The analysis was repeated, and cocaine was found. And nicotine was found in different mummies. But the thing is that the two major, should we say, arguments against her theory is that the botanic evidence is missing and there's no archaeological traces for coca. And because of this, a lot of scientists say that they are not against her analysis, but they are against the historical conclusion. I see it as confirmation bias because if you take valuable materials in historic time, for instance, metals, especially iron, but copper and so on, gold especially, then it's not something you will leave. I mean, it's so valuable that you will have to melt it into new coins or whatever. But also the same. Why should that not apply to if there was trace with South America with cocaine? Then it's highly likely that this will be treated as valuable materials. So that means that you will not just leave it around. You will try to use every single part of it. So if you are having it in some kind of, I don't know, pottery and so on, you will most likely wash it all the way to make sure that you have used every single milligram of that. And the same goes with all valuable things. You will try to use it all the way. Furthermore, I mean, herbs was something that was imported from India and so on. And to my knowledge, herbs has not been found in Egypt, but nobody's arguing against it because you haven't found it. But here you have the argument that goes the other way around. Because you have not found it, then it's not there. What kind of logic is that? If you accept that herbs was used despite that you haven't found it, why should you make a different, should we say, evidence requirements for that? And one of the problems is that you could say, if Balabanova should be more widely accepted, then you probably will require, I don't know, new analysis with modern technology. You will require an isotope analysis of nicotine or cocaine, and you will require a logical found of coca and tobacco in Egypt. But the thing is that a lot of these museums is actually saying that they are rejecting new tests, and it's actually it's understandable why they don't want the money. So, I mean, by the end of the day, you have to, handle the mummy. You have to degrade the mummy. I mean, hair is not something. There's only, should we say, a certain amount of hair, and the same goes with tissues and so on. But not only that, if you have to take it out of the manta, if you have to take it out of should we say, the storage facilities in order to do these tests, then it's likely that the degradation will be accelerated. So the museum does not have, should we say, a motive to allow this kind of tests. And then furthermore, a lot of museums, especially in this area, they are not that interesting in having, should we say, tests of their crown jewels, because if it actually turns out that it's false or something like that, then the museum is, worse off than before, because then it's oh, that's the museum with the false mummies. Things like that also have something to say. So, bottom line is, from my point of view, is that I think that science in general, they are resistant against new ideas. But also, I find it as, should we say, as a false point, because Dr. Balabanova was having 3 additional laboratories. So that, should we say, reduce the possibility of, should we say, local errors. But it's also that the sampling was not, one mistake. I know that critics say, oh, the contamination could happen before the sample was divided. The laboratories could have analyzed the same starting material. So the critics basically means that uh, new samples of new mummies is, you know, required. But critics also argue that if there was a stable commerce route for cocaine or tobacco to Egypt, then you would expect that you could see some uh, samples like plant fibers, pictures in arts, commerce documents, containers, or other kind of packaging materials. And since this has not been found in an Egypt context, then they see it as a possible hypothesis, but it's not confirmed. As I mentioned earlier, I don't think that is an entire legal argument, simply because if it was that valuable, I think that everything would have been used. Furthermore, the argument that pictures in arts and so on, I mean, especially when we're discussing Egypt, I don't think that's a consistent claim because you actually find submarines and helicopters and so on in temples of Egypt, and the same person says, "Oh, that's not a submarine. That is only something that looks like a submarine, but it's not. It has to be considered in a different view." But now, because it's something that challenges their view, then then we require an exact picture. But when you have the exact picture of this in the art, then you're objecting, oh, that's just because that has to be interpreted in a different way. One of the key things here is actually that if you look at South America, you have these sweet potatoes, but that was actually found in Polynesia before the Europeans. So there seems to be a contact, and then of course there was also the Vikings in North America. From a person from like me from the Nordics, uh, we sometimes smiles when you have these requirements. One of the key things is actually that there was no Vikings in North America because they were only living in Newfoundland for I think it was 160 and 180 years. But in order to be recognized as a true settlement, it has to be there for at least 200 years. That is a requirement. I mean, we are smiling of it because if you're living there for more than 150 years, then you're living there. It's ridiculous to have this. Where does this 200 years come from? It it seems more like a rule that is established in order to not recognize the Vikings as the the Vikings for the discovery of North America. But never mind. I use it as an example here, where you seems to have different measurement. When it's something that you need to that support your worldview, then it's okay. But if it does not support, then we change the rules. Furthermore, there's some details I would like to say again once more. Dr. Balabanova, she reported that in some mummies there were very high concentrations of nicotine and there were traces of cocaine in hair and in tissue samples. Some of them was actually quite high and a lot higher than modern smokers. If we are discussing first the contamination from cigarette smoke, then you will expect to have low concentrations. You will have it primarily on the surfaces of, for instance, hair or tissue, but her analysis shows high concentrations and the signal material inside the material. So, in other words, it was coming from the inside and not the surface. So, when you're discussing toxicologists, they actually find that this contamination theory is not a good explanation. when nicotine is consumed by the body, it's transported by blood, it's built in keratin, and then it's trapped inside the hair shaft. If nicotine is coming from the outside, say cigarette smoke, then we will normally be on the surface and it could be washed away. And since Balabanova was using the hair shaft analysis, where the hair is first washed and then analyzed, then if it was environmental contamination from, say, cigarette smoke, then it should be washed away. But if it's inside the hair, then it's a different thing. Nicotine can has been explained by several plants in the nightshade family, as I said earlier, but cocaine is a lot harder to explain because that's only from the coca plants in the Andes areas, in the Andes Mountains in South America. So this is the central thing in this case. So if I need to sum up what we have been discussing today, that is what Balabanova actually did. She is a forensic toxicology with expertise in analysis of narcotic sampling in biological sampling, and she works in a German institute for forensics and used the same method as to be used in today's court. In the project, she analyzed hair, tissue samples, and bone materials from Egyptian mummies. She was using the new methods of the 1980s because it happens in 1991. And then she sent it into, in total, 4 different laboratories. One was her own, but 3 additional laboratories was finding the same conclusions. The nicotine was found in several mummies, cocaine was found in some mummies, and in some cases in very high concentrations. She was using the hair shaft method, where the hair is washed before analysis. If the nicotine is inside the hair shaft after wash, then it is a proof of, should we say, contamination during life and not on contamination. This is normally accepted in forensic medicine. That is the methods that sends people to the death row. So it is something that is challenged every day. Her results was reproduced. It was methodologies from the forensics. It was high concentrations. It was found in hair shafts, and it was found in other mummies, especially the nicotine. What critics is saying is that in the historical context, that the coca plant is known from South America, and there has not been found anything related to coca like fossils, pollen, samples, pictures, and so on in Egyptian context. Furthermore, the mummies has a complex history: plundering, transportation, museum handling, chemical conservation, and so on. This can, in principle, introduce compounds later on that is measured in these tests. There are 4 possible explanations of the findings of Dr. Balabanova. First of all, contamination. It is an explanation, however unlikely it is. You have local plants that we still not know. We know that some plants in the nightshade family has the same compounds. We have the mummification process where the mummification materials can go inside the body after death. And then we have unknown commerce routes. I think that the most realistic conclusion today is that based on this documentation, you could say that Dr. Balabanova's analysis was serious, they was methodical, and they was done with the standard of forensic techniques. The results shows that there is nicotine in the mummies, there are cocaine found, but how it should be interpreted is a different story. As I said earlier, I think that the ball is on not on her side because the methods, the analysis work, the conclusions, and so on are subject every day to scientific reviews in courts all over the world. So if somebody wants to challenge them, I think they should provide some evidence. Thank you for listening.